By the time Grant Mercer turned off the highway and onto the narrow road leading toward the lake, I had already decided the trip was a mistake. 3 days alone with my dad's best friend sounded manageable when my father suggested it. In reality, sitting beside Grant while pine trees closed around the truck felt like volunteering for 72 hours with a man I had spent years trying not to think about. Grant had been everywhere when I was younger: birthdays, weekends, fishing trips, emergency rides home from school. Then, when my family went through the worst year of our lives, he had simply disappeared. At least that was how I remembered it. Grant reached into the cup holder and handed me the coffee he had bought before picking me up. Black. 1 sugar. I stared at it. He glanced over. Still right. You remember that? His mouth tilted. You made enough complaints when people got it wrong. I took the cup without answering. An hour later, we reached the cabin. The lake stretched beyond the trees, dark blue beneath a wide afternoon sky. Grant unloaded the rods while I carried our bags inside. My old preference was already waiting near the door. A medium-action spinning rod. I picked it up. You brought this for me? You always hated the heavier ones. That was when I was 17. You also hated touching live bait. I looked at him. Grant paused with a tackle box in his hand. What? You remember a weird amount about me for someone who vanished. The humor disappeared from his face. For half a second, I thought he might finally answer. Instead, he carried the tackle toward the dock. Inside, I found 2 bedrooms. One had a wide bed facing the lake. The other barely fit a narrow mattress and an old dresser. Grant dropped his bag in the smaller room. You're taking that one? You'll sleep better in the front room. I gave a short laugh. You don't have to take care of me, Grant. I know. You keep acting like I'm still some kid tagging along behind you and Dad. He looked at me then, not casually. His gaze stayed on my face, then shifted briefly downward before returning to my eyes. Something in the air changed. I know you're not a kid anymore, he said quietly. The words should have irritated me. Instead, heat climbed unexpectedly beneath my collar. Grant seemed to notice my reaction because his jaw tightened. He turned away first and headed back outside. I stood alone in the cabin, listening to his footsteps cross the wooden dock. I had come to the lake thinking 3 days would finally confirm everything I already believed about Grant Mercer. We had not even unpacked, and somehow I was already less certain than when we started. Saturday morning came bright and cold enough that mist still hovered above the lake when Grant and I pushed the boat away from the dock. For the first half hour, we barely spoke. Then I lost a fish because I pulled too early. Grant laughed. I turned toward him. Something funny? You still do that. Do what? Get impatient the second you feel something on the line. I was 17 the last time you watched me fish. And apparently 17-year-old Ethan is still responsible for your technique. I cast toward the shoreline. Keep talking, old man. 14 years isn't that much. It is when you're losing. That shut him up. For approximately 30 seconds. Somewhere between the insults and the competition, something uncomfortable happened. We started having fun. Grant knew when to move without being asked. I shifted automatically when he needed space. When he reached behind me for the net, I already had it in my hand. Felt practiced. Familiar. That bothered me more than the silence had. Later, my reel jammed. Give it here, Grant said. I can fix it. I know. He moved beside me anyway. The boat rocked gently as he leaned over the reel. I held the rod while Grant worked the tangled line loose. His shoulder pressed against mine. Hold this. I am holding it. You're pulling. There's a difference? Yes. His hand closed over mine to reposition my fingers. Neither of us moved. Grant's thumb rested against the side of my hand. His face was close enough that I could see the faint lines around his eyes. His gaze lifted. For one strange second, the broken reel seemed completely irrelevant. Then Grant released me. There. He moved back to the other side of the boat. I stared at the reel. You didn't fix it. Grant looked down. The line was still tangled. I laughed before I could stop myself. He muttered something under his breath and reached for it again. This time without touching me. A few minutes later, I asked, "Why do you remember all this stuff?" His hands stopped briefly. "My coffee, the rod, the bait, how I fish. I have a good memory." "That's convenient." Grant looked toward the water. I watched him. "For someone who couldn't wait to get away, you kept a lot of details." His expression changed. "I never said I couldn't wait to get away. You didn't have to." "Ethan." "What?" He exhaled slowly. I waited. Again, he had the perfect opportunity to tell me I was wrong. Again, he didn't take it. Instead, he picked up his rod. That afternoon, Dad called while we were returning to the cabin. I mentioned that Grant apparently remembered everything about teenage me. Dad laughed. "Grant always had a ridiculous memory. Apparently. He had his own life to live back then," Dad said. "We all did." Beside me, Grant went completely still. I ended the call a minute later. Grant concentrated on tying the boat to the dock. "You heard him?" "Yes." "So that's what happened?" He tightened the knot. "You had your own life?" Grant finally looked at me. There was something in his expression I couldn't identify, but it wasn't indifference. "Your father loves you, Ethan." "That wasn't my question." "I know." He walked toward the cabin. I stayed beside the boat, watching him go. Yesterday, I had wanted Grant to explain why he remembered me. Now I wanted to know why every time I gave him a chance to defend himself, he chose silence instead. Grant avoided the subject for the rest of the afternoon. Not obviously. That would have been easier. He cleaned the fish we had kept, reorganized the tackle, and asked whether I wanted dinner before sunset, as if we hadn't just spent the morning circling a question he refused to answer. Eventually, I went looking for spare line. Grant's tackle box was open on the porch table. I found 2 replacement spools in the bottom compartment, but when I moved them aside, something underneath caught my attention. A fishing lure. It was wooden, painted green and yellow, with one eye slightly higher than the other. I knew it immediately. "You've got to be kidding me." Grant stepped onto the porch carrying 2 bottles of water. His expression changed when he saw what I was holding. "Where did you find that?" "In your tackle box." "I gathered that." I turned the lure between my fingers. The paint was chipped around the edges, but there was no mistaking it. I had made it when I was 16. Grant had spent an entire afternoon pretending it looked professional while Dad laughed so hard he'd nearly dropped his beer. "I gave you this." "You did. Why do you still have it?" Grant set the bottles down. "Because it's mine." That isn't an answer. It seemed like one. Despite myself, I almost smiled. Then I remembered what the lure meant. "You kept this for 11 years? Grant leaned against the railing. "Apparently." "Why?" He looked at the lure rather than me. "I never thought about throwing it away." The simplicity of that answer hit harder than it should have. I closed my fingers around the little wooden body. "You kept something I made you for 11 years, but you couldn't pick up a phone?" Grant's expression tightened. "There it is," I said. "Ethan." "No. Explain it to me. You remember my coffee. You remember how I fish. You remember that I hate touching worms. You kept this ridiculous thing." "It's not ridiculous." I stared at him. Grant seemed to realize what he'd said. I held the lure between us. "Then why did you leave?" His jaw flexed. "You keep saying I wanted to leave." The porch suddenly felt very quiet. I stepped closer. "Didn't you?" Grant looked directly at me. For once, there was no joke waiting behind his eyes. "No," he said. One word. Changed the shape of everything. "Then tell me what happened." He looked away. My anger returned immediately. "Right? Of course. It's complicated." "It wasn't complicated from where I was standing." "I know. You disappeared." "I know. And you're still protecting whatever explanation makes that acceptable." Grant's voice dropped. "I didn't say it was acceptable." "Then deny it. Tell me I imagined the whole thing." He couldn't. That silence was different now. Before, I had heard guilt in it. Standing there with that battered lure in my hand, I wasn't sure what I was hearing anymore. I put the replacement line beside my rod and started toward the dock. "Ethan." I stopped. Grant nodded toward the lure. You can leave that. I looked down. Thought you might actually use it. No. Why keep a fishing lure you won't fish with? His eyes met mine. Because I'd rather have it than lose it. Neither of us said anything after that. I placed it carefully back inside his tackle box. By evening, clouds had begun gathering beyond the far ridge, turning the western edge of the lake gray. Grant checked the sky while securing the boat. I watched him from the dock. For years, the story had been simple. Grant left because staying didn't matter enough. Now I knew only two things for certain. He hadn't wanted to leave, and whatever had made him do it, he was still refusing to tell me why. The clouds were still there Sunday morning. Grant stood at the end of the dock studying the sky while I carried the tackle down from the cabin. You planning to fish or negotiate with the weather? He glanced at me. Conditions are fine right now. Comforting emphasis. We stay close. If it turns, we come back. I stepped into the boat. Yes, Captain. That earned the smallest smile. For the first hour, Grant was right. The lake remained calm, though the wind steadily strengthened. We stayed within easy distance of the cabin, working along the shoreline while the sky darkened behind us. Then the motor coughed. Grant looked back immediately, coughed again and died. That sounds expensive, I said. Hold the tiller. The humor vanished from his voice. Grant worked quickly while I kept the boat positioned as best I could. The wind was pushing us farther from the protected shoreline, and small waves had begun slapping hard against the hull. Grant. I know. Rain started. He tried the motor again. Nothing. A stronger wave hit us sideways. Move toward the center, Grant said. I shifted just as another wave rocked the boat. My wet shoe slipped against the floor. The world tilted. I grabbed for the side, missed, and felt my weight carry me backward. Grant caught my jacket with one hand and my arm with the other. Ethan. My hips slammed against the side of the boat, but he hauled me inward before I could go over. For several seconds, his arms stayed locked around me. I'm okay. Grant didn't release me. Grant. His breathing was harder than mine. I'm okay. Finally, he loosened his grip. We stopped arguing with the dead motor. Working together, we managed to get the boat into a protected stretch near shore and make our way back toward the cabin without taking another unnecessary risk. By the time we reached the dock, rain was coming down hard. Inside, I stripped off my soaked jacket and turned toward Grant. He was standing near the table. His hands were shaking. Not dramatically, barely enough to notice. But I noticed. You were scared. Anyone with sense was scared out there. Not about the boat. Grant looked at me. Something inside me snapped. You don't get to do this. Do what? Act like losing me would have destroyed you, and then pretend you barely cared when you walked out of my life. His face hardened. That's not what happened. Then what happened? Ethan. No. Yesterday you said you didn't want to leave. So tell me why you did. Grant turned away. I followed him. Was there another job? Another family? Did Dad do something? What? His shoulders went rigid. I saw it. Dad. Grant closed his eyes briefly. Tell me. When he faced me again, the careful distance he'd maintained all weekend was almost gone. Leaving wasn't entirely my decision. The anger drained out of me. Whose decision was it? Grant said nothing. Was it Dad's? I've already said more than I should have. According to who? According to me. I stared at him. Rain hammered against the cabin roof. You let me hate you. Grant's expression changed, and for the first time I saw something that looked almost like pain. I know. Why? He swallowed. But whatever answer was behind his eyes stayed there. I stepped back. Yesterday, finding that lure had made me question whether Grant had ever wanted to disappear. Now I knew he hadn't made that choice alone. And judging by the way he had reacted when I said my father's name, I was beginning to understand exactly where the rest of the truth was hiding. For a while, neither of us spoke. Rain struck the roof hard enough to fill the cabin with noise, but Grant still seemed too close in the silence between us. I should have kept asking about Dad. Instead, I couldn't stop thinking about Grant's arms around me in the boat, about his shaking hands, about the way he'd looked at me Friday when he'd said he knew I wasn't a kid anymore. "You've spent this whole trip avoiding answers," I said. Grant stared through the rain-streaked window. "Some answers aren't mine to give." "That isn't your decision." "No, maybe it isn't." "Then stop making decisions for me." That finally made him turn. I stepped closer. "You decided I was better off not knowing why you left. You decided I could hate you as long as somebody else stayed protected. What else are you deciding I'm better off without?" His expression sharpened. "Ethan." There was a warning in my name, but something else beneath it. I heard it now. "Why do you keep doing that?" "Doing what?" "Backing away every time this stops feeling like a fishing trip." Grant went still. I could hear my own heartbeat beneath the rain. His voice lowered. "Because there are boundaries I have no business crossing." The words landed between us. This wasn't about 11 years ago anymore. I took another step. Grant didn't move. "Look at me." He did. "Is this only happening in my head?" His jaw tightened. "Grant." No, the answer was barely louder than the rain. My pulse jumped. "No, I'm imagining it?" His eyes held mine. "No, you're not." There it was. Not an explanation. Not enough to solve the past. But enough to change the present completely. I closed the remaining distance and kissed him. For one stunned second, Grant didn't respond. Then his hand came to my waist. He kissed me back. There was nothing hesitant about those few seconds. Every careful look and unfinished sentence from the weekend seemed to collapse into that one unmistakable answer. Then Grant broke away. He stepped back as if distance itself could undo what had happened. "Ethan, don't. You're his son." I stared at him. "I'm 27. "I know." "Then stop talking about me like I'm 17. You think I don't know exactly how old you are?" The force in his voice silenced me. Grant dragged a hand across his face. "That is precisely the problem." I felt the heat of the kiss still on my mouth. "So you want me?" His eyes closed briefly. "That isn't the question." "It is for me." "No. The question is what happens when this weekend ends." I almost laughed. "So the lake made me kiss you?" "I didn't say that." "The storm?" "No." "Then what are you afraid of?" Grant looked at me, and I saw the answer before he spoke. "Your father is my oldest friend." I understood then that Dad wasn't only connected to whatever had happened years ago. He was standing between us now. Grant had admitted the attraction without saying the words. He had kissed me back without leaving any room to call it accidental. And still, somehow, he was trying to protect a boundary built around another man's feelings. Outside, the rain began to soften. Grant looked toward the window. The road should be clear by morning. Yesterday, that would have sounded like good news. Now it sounded like a deadline. Because when we left this cabin, Grant would have every opportunity to put distance between us again. And for the first time, I wasn't wondering whether he wanted to stay. I was wondering whether wanting me would ever be enough to make him choose it. By Monday morning, the storm had moved east. The lake looked almost harmless again. Grant loaded the truck while I stood on the cabin porch watching him behave as though nothing fundamental had changed between us. Finally, I said, "Are we going to talk about last night?" He kept arranging the bags. "I think we should get home." That wasn't my question. Grant shut the tailgate. What happened here was complicated. The kiss wasn't complicated. The circumstances were. I walked down the steps. "You mean the storm, the isolation, what happened on the lake, everything." I stared at him. "You remembered how I take my coffee before there was a storm. Ethan, you kept that lure for 11 years before we came here. You nearly forgot how to fix my reel because you touched my hand. You looked at me like that Friday afternoon." Grant's gaze shifted away. "So don't tell me the weather created this." "I didn't say it created anything." "Then stop treating it like an excuse." His silence gave me the same answer it always did. Except now I knew silence didn't necessarily mean guilt. Sometimes it meant Grant was protecting someone. My phone rang before I could push further. "Dad," I answered. You two alive? He asked. Road's clear. We're leaving now. Good. Grant probably had you worried over nothing. He's always been overprotective where you're concerned. I looked at Grant. He was watching me. Something clicked. Dad, why did Grant leave? Silence. Not confusion. Silence. My stomach tightened. Ethan, this isn't really… Did you ask him to? Grant stepped toward me. Ethan. I raised a hand. Dad exhaled through the phone. You were having a hard time back then. That doesn't answer me. You stopped coming to me. I said nothing. You went to Grant with everything. Problems at school. Things you were angry about. Things you were scared of. I was your father. And I felt like I was watching someone else become the person you trusted. The cabin, the lake, Grant. All of it seemed to recede. So you told him to leave? I asked him to give us space. I looked at Grant. He didn't defend himself. Of course he didn't. And he agreed? After another pause, Dad said, yes. I ended the call. Grant's face was unreadable. You let me believe you abandoned me. I wasn't going to make you choose between us. I didn't get to choose anything. You were 16. And now… Grant flinched slightly. I stepped closer. You knew I blamed you. Yes. You could have told me. And told you your father was jealous of the relationship you had with me? What would that have done except hurt you? You don't know. I knew what I thought was best. I laughed once without humor. That seems to be everyone's favorite excuse. Grant looked down. Suddenly the old lure made sense. The memories made sense. Even his refusal to defend himself made sense. He hadn't forgotten me. He had let me hate him. Some part of me wanted that knowledge to erase 11 years of anger. Didn't. It replaced one kind of anger with another. You sacrificed our relationship to protect mine with Dad. Grant's voice was quiet. At the time, yes. And you still think that was your decision to make. He didn't answer. There it was. The real problem hadn't stayed in the past. Grant was still doing it. Still deciding what I should know. What I should feel. Which boundaries should matter more than what I wanted. I opened the passenger door. We should go. Grant nodded. The drive home was nothing like the drive to the lake. Friday, I had sat beside a man I thought had cared too little to stay. Monday, I sat beside a man who had cared enough to leave because someone asked him to. I finally knew why Grant had disappeared. What I didn't know was whether, given the choice again, he would do exactly the same thing. Grant didn't call that night. He didn't call Tuesday either. By Wednesday, I stopped pretending I wasn't checking my phone. There were no messages. No jokes about my fishing technique. No invitation to finish the conversation we'd started at the cabin. Nothing. Grant had disappeared again. This time, though, I understood exactly why. That made it worse. I found Dad Wednesday evening and asked him the question I'd been avoiding. Do you regret telling Grant to leave? Dad was quiet for a long moment. Yes. The answer surprised me. I was jealous, he said. You trusted him when you wouldn't talk to me. I convinced myself removing him would fix that. Did it? No, I looked away. Dad sighed. Grant shouldn't have carried all the blame. He chose to. He thought he was helping. That seems to be his specialty. Dad studied me. This isn't only about what happened when you were 16, is it? I didn't answer. He didn't press. Instead, he said, whatever is happening between you and Grant now, you're 27. Your relationship with him is your decision. It wasn't permission. I hadn't asked for that. But it removed the last excuse Grant could use to pretend everyone else's choices mattered more than mine. I called him that night. He answered after the 4th ring. Ethan. Hearing. My name in his voice made the previous 2 days suddenly feel longer. You've been avoiding me. I've been giving you space. I didn't ask for space. Silence. I almost laughed. You really haven't learned anything, have you? That's not fair. No? You disappeared when I was 16 because Dad thought it was best for me. Now you're disappearing because you think it's best for everyone. This is different. Why? Because pursuing this could cost me the oldest friendship I have. There it was. Not the storm. Not the age difference. Not uncertainty about what had happened between us. That, again. You're choosing him, I said. I'm trying not to destroy something that's existed most of my adult life. And what about us? Grant didn't answer quickly enough. Something inside me settled. Not because I stopped wanting him. Because I finally understood that I couldn't make this choice for him. I talked to Dad, I said. Grant went quiet. He told me what he did was wrong. He also said whatever happens between you and me is my decision. Ethan, no. Listen, I'm not asking Dad for permission, and I'm done asking you to give me permission to want you. His breathing was audible through the phone. If you don't want this, tell me. You know that's not the problem. Then decide what matters more. It's not that simple. It is from where I'm standing. I waited. Grant said nothing. For years, I had believed his silence meant he didn't care enough to stay. Now I knew better. But knowing why someone leaves doesn't make them any less gone. I won't chase you, Grant. Ethan. Good night. I ended the call before he could answer. Then I put my phone down. For the first time since the fishing trip began, there was no mystery left for me to solve. Grant wanted me. He was afraid choosing me might cost him my father. And if anything between us was going to survive beyond that lake, he would have to decide whether protecting an old relationship was worth losing the new one before it ever had the chance to begin. Grant didn't call Thursday. By Friday evening, I had almost convinced myself that was his answer. Then someone knocked on my door. I knew it was him before I opened it. Grant stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking less composed than I had ever seen him outside that storm-soaked cabin. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I talked to your father. My chest tightened. If you're here because Dad said this is okay. He didn't. That stopped me. Grant looked directly at me. I didn't ask him to. I opened the door wider, but Grant stayed outside. What did you ask? Nothing. His jaw tightened. I told him. Told him what? That 11 years ago, he asked me to step away, and I did because I thought protecting his relationship with you mattered more than mine. I waited. And I told him I'm not doing it again. The words landed harder than I expected. Grant continued before I could respond. I spent most of this week telling myself staying away was the responsible thing. That whatever happened at the lake complicated your relationship with your father. That wanting you wasn't worth risking a friendship I've had for most of my adult life. Sounds familiar. I know. There was no defense in his voice. That phone call Wednesday made something very clear. What? You weren't asking me to save you from a difficult decision. He paused. You were asking me to stop making it for you. I said nothing. Grant looked toward the street for a moment, then back at me. Your father may be angry with me. Things between us may change. I don't know what that friendship looks like after this. There was the cost. Not theoretical anymore. He had walked directly into it. But if I disappear again because I'm afraid of losing him, then I'm doing exactly what I did 11 years ago. I stepped onto the porch. Grant didn't retreat. I thought leaving back then was proof that I cared enough to put you first, he said. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe sometimes caring about someone means staying long enough to let them decide whether they want you there. My throat tightened. He was close now, but he didn't touch me. For once, Grant wasn't assuming what I needed. He was waiting. Ethan. Yeah. His eyes held mine. Do you want me to stay? The question carried 11 years inside it. The cabin. The lure. His shaking hands after nearly losing me in the lake. The kiss he'd returned and then tried to explain away. Every silence. Every departure. This time, there was no storm trapping us together. No dead motor. No remote cabin. Grant had his truck parked 10 feet away. The road behind him was clear. He could leave. So could I? Yes, I said. Grant released a breath. I want you to stay. His hand rose slowly to my face, giving me every opportunity to move away. I didn't. I kissed him first. Grant kissed me back. And this time he didn't stop after a few seconds. There was no sudden retreat, no warning about my father, no attempt to rename what was happening. When we finally separated, his forehead rested briefly against mine. "I don't know how easy this is going to be," he said. "I didn't ask for easy." A quiet laugh escaped him. "What are you asking for?" "You." His expression softened. "Then you have me." I shook my head. "Not as Dad's best friend who occasionally kisses me during weather emergencies. That happened once. Still a concerning precedent." He smiled. Then the smile faded into something more serious. "A real relationship," he said. "If that's what you want." "It is." "Then that's what I want too." Grant had spent 11 years believing leaving was the most loyal thing he could do. But the fishing trip had ended 5 days ago. The storm was gone. The danger was gone. Nothing was keeping him beside me anymore. Nothing except choice. And this time, Grant stayed. Several months later, Grant stood at the end of the same dock holding my old handmade lure between his fingers. "You brought it all the way back here just to not use it again?" He inspected the chipped green and yellow paint as if I had asked him to throw something valuable into the lake. "Correct. It was literally made for fishing. It was badly made for fishing." I looked at him. "You told me it wasn't ridiculous." "It isn't ridiculous. It's structurally questionable." I laughed. Grant smiled and returned the lure carefully to his tackle box before reaching for one he was actually willing to lose. Some things hadn't changed. Most things had. The first time we'd come here, every silence between us had felt like evidence of something missing. Now silence could simply mean Grant was concentrating on his line while his knee rested comfortably against mine. He still remembered my coffee. I still pulled too early when a fish struck. He still complained about it. But now, when I told him to shut up, he sometimes kissed me. There was nothing dramatic about that weekend. That was what made it matter. No storm trapped us inside the cabin. No broken motor forced us to depend on each other. No danger made feelings easier to mistake for adrenaline. We had returned because we wanted to. And when Grant reached for my hand as we walked back toward the cabin that evening, there was no hesitation before his fingers closed around mine. 4 years. I'd believed Grant's absence proved how little I had mattered to him. The truth was almost the opposite. He had cared enough to convince himself that leaving was an act of love. I didn't romanticize that anymore. His choice had hurt both of us, and understanding it didn't erase what it cost. But Grant had finally learned there was another kind of courage in staying. On Sunday afternoon, we packed the truck and carried the last of the gear from the cabin. Grant stopped beside the dock. The lake behind him looked almost exactly as it had when we'd arrived months earlier. He glanced toward the truck, then at me. "Ready to head home?" I remembered the man who had driven me here the first time. Dad's best friend. The man I thought had abandoned me. The man I believed 3 days at a lake would finally prove I had been right about all along. Instead, I had discovered the lure he couldn't throw away, the truth he wouldn't use to defend himself, and the feelings neither of us could leave behind once the storm was gone. Now Grant stood in front of me, waiting instead of deciding for me. I reached for his hand. "I already am,"